been reading this and I've been reading that, and I thought maybe I would continue on with my fourth point last week about the liberty of forgiveness and how God comes to set us free. And I said, but it's not really forming together in my mind the way I want it to. And then I said something like this, and then I said something like that. And then I said, but in Ruth, this is what Ruth's going through. She's walking this walk. She's doing the thing. It's not just that she decided to follow Naomi, no, going back. We see all of these things start to happen in her life, and it's pretty exciting, you know. I was just reminded of it this week, and she was like, okay, I don't know, what's the question? I was like, so what do you think I ought to preach? She goes, well, one of those it sounds like you already have done in your mind, and the rest you haven't really gotten started on. So just do that one. Good thing, babe. You need someone like that in your life to just kind of show you the way. And then, as I got in here, pardon me, I was just trying to get started, and I was reading in Matthew chapter 7 and going through it. And I was just I had formed the thought for her, and she goes, man, it just sounds like pressing on. Didn't Paul press on in Philippians? And I was like, girl, you preaching this thing or am I this week? So anyway, Paul talks about pressing on, that I've not attained the goal, but I keep pressing on. Today we are going to talk about walking the walk, and I want to jump right into our first point. Where does any good walk start? Last week we said, when life hits us, we know we've grown if we just keep following Jesus. When it's easier to go back to where we used to be. For Ruth, it would have been much easier to go back to Moab than it would to go to Israel. And she decided, I'm walking the walk. No turning back. The first thing you have to know is the place where walk starts. Walk starts right where you're at. You have to just start walking. Unfortunately, sometimes in Christianity, we think that God is actually a genie or a magician, that he's going to have, we're going to come to the altar, and the pastor's going to come down with a lamp, and we're going to rub it, and the genie's going to come out, and we've got 3 wishes, and suddenly all the problems that we brought to the altar, all the circumstances that brought us to the Lord are just going to magically disappear, and we get to start walking miles ahead of the place that we started. And that is, in fact, not true at all. God is not a genie. We don't get to rub a lamp. He doesn't just make things disappear out of our life in that moment. Unfortunately, when we decide to follow Jesus, we got to start walking. It's following Jesus. Let's go back to Ruth chapter 2 and see where she starts. Ruth chapter 2 and verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. So I want to give you some backstory on what Ruth is doing here. In Levitical law, Moses was told by God to make certain provisions for the poor and for the sojourner. So people who didn't have anything or were strangers in a foreign land. So, as they were harvesting crops, they would be a little bit messy with them. And on the fringes of the field, they would just leave little bits that they couldn't get. And this is dealing with wheat, so the wheat were wrapped into sheaves. So that couldn't be put in the sheaves cleanly, was just left on the fringe. So someone could come behind and what they called glean this. They could pick up the scraps. So they had something to eat. This was their way of taking care of the poor and the traveler, right? So why is it that you think that Ruth asks Naomi permission to go into a field of people she doesn't know, in a land she doesn't belong in, and start gleaning wheat? It's because when Ruth made the decision to follow Naomi, they didn't have anything. They had lost everything in Moab, so they're coming back to a place she doesn't know, to a people she's never been with, to a home they don't have, with food they can't eat. Sometimes we have to decide to follow Jesus in the dark moments. If we're going to take that walk, that's the place the walk's going to start. Unfortunately, you don't go from the position you're in all the way to the end. You don't get to finish the race the day you start walking. You just start walking. Zig Ziglar wrote a book, I'll see you at the top. And in that book, on the cover, there was a picture of an elevator, and it said out of order, and a sign pointing to the stairs. One of the things that we wish is in this life and in this walk with Jesus, we could just push the elevator to the penthouse and bypass all of the tough steps. to go along in a walk. But unfortunately, there is no elevator to the top. In this life, we have to walk. Paul knew it better than anyone. He said, I press on, not believing that I've already attained that which is in front of me, but continuing to press on daily in hope that I attain my heavenly reward. Now, I can tell you, if Paul, who is the author of at least a third of the New Testament, had to continue to press on daily, if Paul had to walk his walk, if he had to go through being blinded on the road to Damascus and then being prayed with so the scales could fall off, spending more than a decade in Saudi Arabia at the place where Moses received the law, and then going from this place to that place, probably one of the greatest travelers in the world. I bet you Paul had frequent flyer miles that we couldn't believe. If he was a part of American Airlines or the Marriott or Hilton programs, he would be a diamond or a platinum with each of them, because God just had Paul on the road all the time. And in each of those places, he went to the very place that they hated him the most. He would start in the Jewish synagogues. But Paul was a traitor. Paul had been a member of the Sanhedrin. He starts this chapter listing his credentials. Who could boast other than me? I'm the Jew of Jews. Top of my class. Memorized the entire Torah. Promoted at the youngest age. Persecutor of the church. Blameless under the law. And then, having been a persecutor of the way, I converted to the way. And now I'm going to the people who are persecuting the way. And I'm telling them that they're wrong. I just want to ask you a question. How do you respond when people tell you you're wrong? You like it? Anyone like it when people tell them they're wrong? Man, I hate it. I don't care if it's my children, especially when they're right. Dad, you're wrong. Think you're out of your jurisdiction. I don't like it when it's my parents. I don't like it when it's my spouse. I don't like it when it's my boss. I don't like it when it's my friends. I hate being told I'm wrong. They didn't take kindly when Paul told them they were wrong. But this was the walk that Paul had to go on. This was the place that God had. Ruth had to start her walk somewhere, and she didn't get to start in the penthouse. She started by going out into a field. She had no one else to provide for her family. There was no men left. So in order for Naomi and Ruth to eat, she had to go huff it. She had to go hustle. She had to go out in the heat behind the workers and get little bits of grain. I can tell you, our walk has to start in the place that we're at. So when you decide to follow Jesus, just know this. Everything's not going to magically be better that day. All of those circumstances that brought you to the Lord are still going to be there staring you in the face. You're still going to have to confront them eye to eye. The difference is, you now have the one who spoke this world into existence working through you. We now have the resurrection power of God inside of us, and you now have the ability to overcome those circumstances. One of the things I take hope in is that in Romans it says the steps of a good man are ordered of the Lord. Just know when you start to take this walk, even if you have to start in this place like Ruth did, going out and picking up scraps on the edge of the field, the steps of a good man are ordered of the Lord. And as we go through this walk, I'm going to prove that to you. Okay? So the first thing you need to know is a walk starts right where you're at. You decided to follow Jesus, that's great. That's not a lottery ticket. You're not going to have bags of money now at your door. You're not going to pay off all your debt that day. You're just going to start following Jesus. And you're going to find that that's even better than all the things that you wish you had. Number two, if you didn't already get this, let me just reinforce this point. Number two is it's not going to be easy. I told you about Paul's life for a reason. Because Paul had a good life. He was a person of reputation. He was a person of position. He was a person of status. He was a person of wealth before he gave all of that up to follow the way. As you go through Paul's letters, what you see is him thanking churches like the Church of Philippi here in Philippians for their willingness to give to his cause. Not that he needs them to give. Paul had a skill. He was a tent maker. Sometimes I think God's put me in a hotel so I can relate with Paul, the tent maker. And I think, boy, Paul, I'm so sorry that this is what you had to do. because that's not a fun existence. It's not joyful. There's always a problem when you have lodging for other people. Because, you know why? In our lives, when we walk, other people show up. You know, people can ruin a real good time. Even the people you love the most, sometimes they show up at your door and you think, well, I really wish you weren't here because we were doing just fine before you got here. Unfortunately, that's the truth, right? We have 4 children. Y'all didn't know that, right? Our kids are pretty quiet, I'm assuming they don't bother anything, right? You probably didn't even notice we had all 4 of them. I notice it because they're neither quiet or unassuming, and yes, they bother everything. They touch literally every surface. I told you guys last week, Kayla had just given Cooper and Lucy a bath, and Jude and I were doing something. I was feeding Boone a bottle, and there was a coffee cup laying there. And here comes Lucy. She tosses her towel off like she's Superwoman, and then she walks right over, grabs a cup of coffee, and dumps it on her head. And I thought, oh my goodness. People will ruin a real good time. This life isn't easy. Just when you think you're getting to the place that God has you, just when you think you're about to have a breakthrough, you're going to find that life isn't easy. Why do I say that? Because Ruth wasn't doing a fun job. She wasn't out living her best life now. She wasn't promised a mansion on this earth. You know what? Had she decided to follow the wide path, and I'm going to turn to Matthew 7, you don't have to follow me there, I'll just read it, it's going to be quick. She decided not to follow the wide path. The wide path was to go back to Moab. Moab was the place of her home, the place of pagan gods. I bet she would have been accepted by her people, probably taken in by her family, probably allowed to worship in the temples of Dagon and Baal and Ashtaroth and Molech, probably given of their pagan sacrifices, probably given the fat of the lamb. She probably had people in her household who would provide for her, but she knew what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 13, if you want to write it down in your notes. He said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only few find it." She chose the narrow gate. There was a wide path that had everything that we think of in this life. But what Ruth knew, it's not about this life. We are pressing on for the long-term play. It's like investing in your 20s. You can never invest from the age of 30 to the rest of your life. You can never invest the same money that you could have made if you had invested between 20 and 30, because it's the long play, because you have so many years for that to accumulate on your behalf. But we are the world and the generation of instant gratification. We have to have everything right now. We've developed this little point system with our kids, and it's a positive and negative reinforcement system. And so it's kind of like chores. Some of them are chores, some of them are manners, some of them are just being good people, right? And then when they do something good and they're not told to do it, they just do it because it's in their heart to do it, they get a point. And when they tell you no and they throw a fit and they do things that you don't want them to do, they lose a point. Every time they get a point, I have to hear, how much closer am I to getting the da-da-da-da-da at the end of the rainbow, right? We're not very close. I want to teach them delayed gratification. We don't get everything right now. Just because Ruth decided to follow Naomi didn't mean that all of existence was going to change. Life is not easy. It is a narrow gate for a reason. Few people want to follow Jesus because guess what? Jesus didn't initially go to a throne given a crown and a scepter. He walked to a cross. He walked to a beating. He walked to humiliation. He walked to torture. The crown he was given was a crown of thorns. The scepter he was given was nail scars in his hands. But it's those hands who we have to seek the applause of, because if you get the applause of nail-scarred hands, the ridicule of anyone else doesn't really matter. We are living this life and walking this walk for an audience of one. Ruth knew that day. That's why she was willing to follow Naomi and take on her God and her people and walk the walk. No, it wasn't going to be easy. I'm sure she didn't wake up every morning thinking, oh goody, I get to go find a field. I don't even know what field to go to. I get to go find a field in the heat, and I get to pick up other people's scraps that they throw behind. Who wants to do that? Hey guys, I got a job offer for you. It doesn't pay anything. But you get to go out, pick your own field, hope that the farmer doesn't attack you, and they might leave some scraps at the end, and you can just walk around all day behind them and pick it up in the heat. And whatever you get to pick, that's what you get to eat, right? Now, did you notice she didn't go to a shift at Domino's? She wasn't following someone around getting pizzas that were overbaked, thinking like, ooh, I get something delicious at the end of this. She's getting grain. Y'all ever just sit and eat grain? Is that what you do in your house? You just grab oats out of the container. Those oats are so good. No, this was hard. This wasn't an easy life. She wasn't on the wide road. She had chosen the narrow road. If you decide to follow Jesus, I'm not telling you it's going to be easy. I'm telling you it's going to be worth it. Yeah. All right. Number 3. There's providence along the way. When I say providence, most people think coincidence. I want to show you what the providence is, and then I want to tell you that providence exists in our lives, okay? And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Verse 4, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseers, what does the young woman belong to? Who does this young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came to the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. So Naomi didn't tell her whose field to go into. Ruth just walked out and thought, well, this field looks as good as any. I'll just ask the owner of this field if I can glean here. And they said, yeah. But at the beginning of this chapter, it says that Boaz was a worthy man. That's the original Hebrew. It calls him a worthy man. A worthy man meaning a nobleman or a knight, someone who was invested in the cause, someone who was charitable, someone who was kind to the underdog, someone who was willing to take care of the sojourner. Boaz wasn't just one of the field owners, he was the field owner. Now you could say, Brother Nathan, she could have just gotten lucky, right? Who thinks she just got lucky? I don't believe in luck. I believe that the Spirit of the Lord began taking the walk with her the minute that she decided to follow Naomi. I believe the Spirit of the Lord begins following you the day you say, I'm going to follow Jesus, no turning back. And so, when the Bible says the steps of a good man are ordered of the Lord, I believe that the steps that you take, if you are following Jesus and you are locked in with the Holy Spirit, He is guiding those footsteps and He is going to divinely direct you into the paths of people who bless you and not curse you, into the paths of people who need you to bless them and not curse them. Yep. Brother Nathan, have you ever seen providence in your life? Well, I can tell you, I have. Do you guys care if I tell you a couple quick personal stories about providence? One of them involves all of you. So in November of last year, my father had stumbled back in here, and he desperately needed someone to take care of him. And when I say desperately, I mean he had gotten to a point where I was having to take him to work with me every day because he just wasn't himself. He was not functioning in the way that he ought to be functioning. He had resigned another church, and there was just something wrong with him. He was in a really bad place. And Ruthie Dowdy called and said, Brother Joe, we've lost our pastor. Is there any way you'd fill in a Sunday for us? Of course, Ruthie. And I thought, boy, that's not going to go well. Dad, can I see your notes before you decide to preach them? And he said, I think this is going to be good. And he preached, and he goes, well, I hope I did a good job. And then I believe it was Lynn called him and said, Brother Joe, would you be interested in coming back next week? And he said, well, I've got absolutely nothing else going on other than my son makes me go to work with him now. So I'll see you Sunday. And Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, he was here. And I saw him getting better. And I saw him getting healthier. And I saw him getting confidence. And I heard his preaching was getting back to what the standard was, and he was starting to be my dad again. I thought, that's providence, right? So he decided to go to the eye doctor because he said, son, I'm having a hard time seeing now that I'm feeling better. I said, okay. We went to the eye doctor and they said, well, your blindness is bad. You have 2250 vision in both eyes. And he goes, oh, well, that explains why I really can't see anything. I shouldn't be driving, should I? So they decided to give him LASIK surgery in November. And on the day he was getting LASIK surgery, he said, son, I can't preach Sunday. I said, okay. Well, what are you going to do? I said, you probably just have Lynn fill in, right? He goes, well, I was hoping maybe you would fill in for me. And it's right there after Thanksgiving. I don't want to be a burden to you, but would you be willing? I said, sure. Let's do it. So I filled in. Then he got the other eye surgically repaired 2 weeks later. So on December the 11th, I believe it was, I filled in again. And I must have done okay because then when he decided God was moving him on his walk to someplace else, I got a call from Shane McManus and said, we would love to talk to you about the idea of becoming our pastor. Now, I've never been a pastor before, Shane, so I can tell you I'm probably going to be a train wreck. But I'm willing to drive the train for a little while if you'll just give me the keys, buddy. Show me how to start that thing up. And here we are. And I'm so excited, and I hope you all are excited too. That's providence. There is no way that God wasn't ordering everybody's footsteps in that way. I'm going to give you another moment of providence, just so you know, well, that could have been a one-off, right? When I was 9 years old, I was born in upstate New York in a little town you've never heard of, along the Ohio River. So if you follow the Ohio River up to Pittsburgh, on the other side of Pittsburgh, it turns into the Allegheny. And the Allegheny goes to a little town in New York called Allegheny. And Allegheny is in a county called Cattaraugus County, and it's probably about the size of Ballard County. So, real small, right? My dad got a call. He went to pastor a church in Paducah, and when the board was trying to figure out where we ought to live, because we didn't know, they said, what about Reedland? And my dad is this person, sure, sounds great. Reedland sounds lovely. He didn't know. He didn't know. So I get to school there, and the first person I meet at Reedland Elementary School in the 4th grade is a short, little, unassuming guy, and his name was Cody. And Cody and I have laughed over the years. You know, in every school class, there's kind of the outcast, or the kid who doesn't shower enough, or his parents don't make him wear deodorant, kind of the smelly kid, right? And we keep thinking, who was the smelly kid at Reedland? He goes, it must have been you and I, because I can't think of anybody else. So, oh, that's why it was just you and I hanging out all the time, right? And Cody was a kid from Wycliffe, and his parents divorced, and they moved to the Farley-Reedland line. And on one side of the street, the kids went to Reedland, and on the other side of the street, they went to Farley. And in the 3rd grade, they enrolled him at Reedland. So we moved here, and he became my best friend. In the 6th grade, his mom and her second husband divorced, and she moved into Houston, Texas. And when moms move, kids move with them. That's how this works. And so after that, I didn't see Cody anymore, because at the end of the 7th grade, my parents divorced, and my mom and I moved to Detroit, Michigan. So one of us was in the great southeast, and the other one was in the great northeast, or great southwest and the great northeast. That might as well have been 10 universes apart, because there were no cell phones, there was no Facebook, we didn't have email. We were 2 kids who just lost your best friend, right? Divine providence kicks in. In the year 2000, a little church in Wycliffe, Kentucky calls my dad, who has been out of the ministry since a divorce, struggling, and says, we would love it if you fill in. And he filled in. And they said, Brother Joe, we'd love it if you came back. And as he kept coming back, he became the pastor of this church. And so I was here in the summer of 2003 after I graduated high school. And he said, son, if you would, I've got some hospital visitations to do today. I'd like you to go with me. Now, I was 18 and not always willing and agreeable to do those things, but I said, okay, Dad, I'll go with you. Let's do it. So we walk into a man's room, and he said, now this man doesn't go to my church, but it's someone in the community, and they've asked me to pray for him. So I'm going to pray with you, okay? Just stand in the corner and don't be ridiculous. You know, whatever he said. Don't make a scene. Isn't that what you tell your kids? I don't know. He was basically just like, stand there and be quiet. Okay. And I walked in, and this man who was on his deathbed, his eyes lit up. And he looked at me and he said, I know you. I thought, I don't know you. And I left, and I got a call later that day on my dad's cell phone. It was my friend Cody. He goes, hey, you were in my dad's room today. You were there praying with him. And he said, I would love to see you while you're in town. Yeah, buddy. Flash forward a year, I moved here. He wouldn't leave me alone. After I saw him, he wouldn't leave me alone. Buddy, you gotta move here. I've got an apartment for you. When I got here, I realized he had an apartment with 2 roommates and no open bedrooms, so I had to move on campus. So then we had a little youth event here. It was Labor Day 2005. And he kept telling me, there's this girl I want you to meet. You've got to meet her. And he was so excited that we couldn't even go in and like, buddy, I got some kids here. I gotta do my thing. Is this girl getting here? She pulled up out of the car, said, this girl. And if I didn't come back here, I wouldn't have my wife of 12 years, my 4 beautiful babies, and I wouldn't be the pastor of this church, and my life would be in a very different place. And you could say, Brother Nathan, that all sounds like a bunch of coincidences. But I can tell you, without them, my life wouldn't mean anything. And without you, I wouldn't know that God directs the steps of a good man. He orders them of the Lord. So I tell you, Ruth didn't just pick a random field. The Spirit of God led her to Boaz. And so when you decide to take a walk with God, yes, you have to start in the place where you start. And no, it's not going to be easy, but along that walk, you're going to find that God has directed you to the people that need you and to the people that you need. And someday you're going to see, if I hadn't stumbled into that field, if we hadn't moved from Allegheny, New York to Paducah, Kentucky, me kicking and screaming as a 9-year-old kid, if I hadn't gone with my dad to that hospital room, if that girl hadn't showed up at our little lock-in here in Wickliffe, Kentucky, where would my life be today? I can tell you, choose the narrow gate, because as you do, there is providence to get you through this life, and I thank God for it. And don't you dare call it a coincidence when He gives you providence.
Amen.
Because He's the one ordering your steps. And that leads me to number 4. Don't write off the blessings. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, in everything, give thanks. In everything, in every circumstance, thank the Lord, because He's the one who's guiding your steps. I can tell you, Paul continued to say things. I rejoice in all circumstances. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. In all things, give thanks, for that is the will of God unto you. Paul's life wasn't easy, but in all things he gave thanks, because when he was shipwrecked, it gave him the opportunity to lead people to Christ. And when he was in prison and the earthquake happened and the chains fell off of them, and the prison guard thought, I'm just going to go ahead and take my own life because they're going to kill me if all of these prisoners escape. And Paul said, fret not, we're here. And he had the opportunity to do ministry because God was the one ordering his steps, because he pressed on, because he was just willing to take a walk. So, as Ruth walks around and she doesn't even realize that God has ordered her steps to this field, and she doesn't even realize that not only is Boaz allowing her to glean, what he tells his reapers is this: don't just leave the scraps for Ruth. Don't just leave the scraps. Open up the sheaves and begin to throw real grain in her path. As you walk, it may not be the blessing you think you deserve when you're in the world. But God is going to just throw provision and blessing into your path. Don't you dare write that off. Don't you dare miss the blessing of being alive today. Don't you dare miss the blessing of having air conditioning when it's 118 degrees in Western Kentucky, when we're setting heat index records. Don't you dare miss the blessing of having a roof over your head, regardless of what that roof is, when it begins to hail and storms begin to shake. Don't you dare write off that blessing that you have food on your table and you don't have to walk behind the reapers to pick up the scraps. Thank God there's someone who's opening up the sheaves and throwing down the real grain for you. They don't have to do that, but God does it because He loves you. because not only did you decide to choose him, guess what? He chose you. That's the thing that we forget. In the story of Ruth, what becomes clear is that Boaz is a type of Christ. And in all of this, Ruth thinks she's walked into Boaz's field, and she thinks she's picking up the scraps of Boaz, and she thinks she's the one choosing him. And all along, he was watching, thinking, honey, I choose you. You know, it was supposed to be illegal to marry a Moabite, right? That was what Jewish law was. I can tell you, Jesus didn't become a rebel when he got to the New Testament. He didn't just act like a rebel and a revolutionary when the Pharisees came around. What we're going to find is Ruth, this Moabite, who it ought to have been illegal for Boaz to even marry, becomes the great-grandmother of David. And it's in the line of David that we get Jesus, the Messiah. Start taking the walk, because you have no idea where God is going to walk you to. You have no idea the blessings that are coming into your path. And you have no idea the people who are going to be blessed because they've come into your life. The day I met this girl in 2005, I had no idea what a blessing she was going to be to me. But I could not imagine a day of life or a breath without her there making sure I'm breathing. And sometimes she has to make sure, because you know what? I don't sleep that great. I snore real loud. And she takes care of me. And that's providence. That's blessing. Each of you who have come into my path are a blessing. You have no idea the blessing I get just from seeing you twice a week, just from getting a phone call telling me everything's going to be okay, just from praying with you when you're in surgery, just from a casual word, just from saying, hey, I really like that thing you're pouring out. It showed me a new dimension of myself. Hey, I've got an idea for this church. Hey, I'm so excited about this youth event. I think it's really going to take off. Hey, I've got a friend that I'd really like to introduce you to. Man, what incredible blessings. I think about the old song. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done in your life. When you start counting, what you'll find is you think you're going to get to 10. And when you get to 1,000, if you're being honest with yourself, you're going to think, my hand is cramping, and I've got to stop counting these blessings because I'm overwhelmed by it. Because what I need to do for the rest of the day is just take the day off and get alone quiet and say, thank you, Lord Jesus. Where would I be if you haven't come into my life? Y'all ready for more? All right. Number 5. So we started walking where we were. We figured out this walk wasn't going to be easy, but we know God is giving us divine providence, and we're seeing the blessings, and we're not discounting them. But we've got to be obedient on this walk. Oh, man, I was really enjoying this till we start talking about obedience again. How come every 4th week you want to talk about obedience, Pastor? Well, because I raise children, and you know what? Obedience is a big part of what we do. They've almost got me trained to listen to them. One of these days. 1 Samuel says it this way. 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 22. Obedience is greater than sacrifice, and listening intently greater than the fatted ram. What God requires out of us is obedience. Brother Nathan, what does that have to do with Ruth's story? What does Boaz tell her? He says, listen to me. Do not glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink with the water jars the men have filled. Why is it important to be obedient? Because in Boaz's field, everyone's been instructed to take care of Ruth. Everyone's been instructed to throw provision in her way. Everyone's been instructed to bless her. Everyone's been instructed to keep her safe. Everyone's been instructed to keep her hydrated on a hot day. Everyone has been instructed in that field to make sure that Ruth has everything she needs for her walk. Naomi tells her later, stay in Boaz's field, because there are some fields here in the era of the judges where the men aren't so nice, and they're not going to take care of you, and they're not going to treat you like a lady, and they're going to assault you and harm you, and they don't mean well of you. Stay in Boaz's field and listen to him. I can tell you obedience is greater than sacrifice, Because in order for the Lord to plan our steps, to get us to the place He wants us to go, in order for Him to throw blessings in our path, we have to walk the way He's telling us to go. So sometimes we look around and we think, God, why in the world did you lead me here? And then you realize, go back in your mind. No, I told you to zig and you decided to zag because you didn't trust me. Obedience is about trust. Do I trust the person giving the directions? If your children are constantly bucking you when you're giving them direction, it's because they don't trust you. That's the issue you have to work on. You have to go back to the place of why they don't trust you, and you have to regain their trust. Because once they trust you, they'll listen to you. If they don't listen to you, it means they don't trust you. They don't think that good things are coming from you. They don't think that you want to bless them and not curse them. They don't think that you have a future and a hope in mind. Sometimes we've been wounded in church far more than we've been wounded in the world. Has anyone ever told you that? Most of the atheists in this country grew up in Bible-believing churches with people who wounded them. It's real hard to trust a God when the people who are doing work in His name are the ones that you have to close your eyes and think, God, I know I need to pray for them, but I just don't want to. I just don't want them to be blessed. I don't want you to work in their life because they're mean and they hurt me. Right? Hey, I grew up in church. I've watched mean-spirited people try to ruin everything that my family ever did. We lived in a parsonage when I grew up in New York, and it was 1 block from the church. And we couldn't go through one family dinner without someone just barging in our door. Because guess what? The church paid for the parsonage, so we were theirs. We worked for the company store. There was no separation of church and state. We just had to deal with it. Right? Because church people are mean-spirited people. They're people. And like I said at the beginning, people could ruin a good barbecue. It's hard to trust God when the people operating in His name are the ones who have hurt us the worst. If you find yourself questioning everything God tells you to do, go back to the place where you lost your trust. Ruth was able to trust Boaz because there had been no evidence of anything but good things coming from him. She saw that he was a good man. She saw that the workers responded to him. The people there were already taking care of her. They were already letting her eat of the grain. It was easy to be obedient to his direction. And yet when she goes home, she tells Naomi, and Naomi has to reinforce, listen to